Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Mexico reported the most violent year on history last year. The violence, the corruption, and the lack of rule of law has become a fact of life that new generations are growing up with. This poses real challenges for youth. On today's show, we're going to talk about some of those challenges by an author of books and stories for youth that face these issues head on. We're very pleased to have with us today Agustin Cadena. Agustin, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Agustin is an award-winning poet and author of stories and books for adolescents and children. Agustin, I wanted to ask you, as a writer, what drew you to literary production for adolescents and children?
I think young readers in general are more receptive and more honest in their opinion about books than the kind of grown-up readers I met before. On the other hand, I like to write about adventure, which is nowadays is more common among young readers' literature than among adults' literature.
Do you have contact in your daily life with adolescents and with young people that gave you this interest to want to speak directly to them?
Yes, I spend 10 months out of every year in Europe, but when I am here in the summer, I usually teach workshops or seminars for adolescents, and I have taught in a couple of correctional institutions for teenage infractors. So I keep in touch with them, with their world, at different levels, for different social classes, social layers.
Kids in prison, there must be a lot of stories there. As you talk with them and as reflected in your work, what do you see as the major problems and challenges that youth are facing here in Mexico now?
Yeah, well, nowadays I think the growing problem of violence and organized crime has affected all levels of social life, family life, breaking the social tissue, breaking families apart. So children are growing up more with deeper feelings of loneliness,
fear.
Yes, fear, of course, and abandonment, and
anger.
And this crisis of values that I think is affecting them very deeply.
They see a society that is in many ways out of control, where there's impunity, there's a lack of justice. How do you internalize that when you're in the midst of trying to define your own identity and your relationship to that society? Is that one of the issues that you deal with in your book?
Yes, and also, well, lack of opportunities and a pessimistic view of life, pessimistic idea of the future. But I have noticed this not only in Mexico. Only in Mexico, maybe it is more closely related to the organized crime issues.
Yeah, so you see this as well in Europe?
Yes.
Where they're facing challenges and certain confusion about how to relate to societies that they judge harshly. I mean, that's what I see when I talk to youth, that they're very critical of society, and that makes it difficult for them to figure out what's my role in this society.
Yes, and to try to come to terms with what society offers.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that literature can help them confront a lot of these questions? What's your objective when you write a novel for youth?
Well, when I have been teaching at these correctional institutions, I think literature has helped them in the first place because it offers a cathartic opportunity. So I have seen these kids who apparently look very tough and wild and even heartless, but then they read things like Oscar Wilde's Ballad of the Reading Owl, and then they start crying because they in the end, they are sensitive people, they are sensitive human beings. And there is a part of humanity which has not been destroyed by the outside environment.
And oftentimes, the outside environment is reluctant or unable to find that or to recognize that, especially with a system that's so punitive. You did something wrong, you go to prison, you're
Yes.
a bad person.
Yes.
And if that becomes the label from the time when kids are young, it's very difficult to get rid of it later, I think. Do you recall a specific example of a young person who was deeply affected by literature in one of your courses?
Yes, I remember the case of, this is happened many years ago when I was a student at the university and I started teaching in these places. And I had a student who belonged to one of the gangs in the west of Mexico City, Panchitos, a famous gang of the 1990s. And he was there because there was a fight between two rival gangs, and he happened to hit another kid with a knife on a very sensitive artery, and then the other boy bled to death. So my student was punished because of manslaughter, but it was technically an accident, and he was not really a part of the gang. He happened to be caught between fires, but he was very sensitive, and he was the one who really got to enjoy the readings and even to start writing on his own.
Do you remember a specific book that reached him?
Yes, Jose Revuelta's diaries or autobiographical works about his years in prison.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So could relate to it. Well, let's talk about some of your latest books. We have here La Casa de los Tres Perros that I hear is being translated to English, right?
It's in the process of being translated, yes.
And this just came out recently. And another book called El Príncipe de los Tejados. Tell us about these books.
These are my latest books for young readers, and both of them deal with this kind of very contemporary issues like the loneliness of the new generation, the centennials, or in a broader way called millennials. Mm-hmm. Like loneliness, they feel lonely, they hurt themselves. In this book, they try to commit suicide. In this book, they actually succeed at committing suicide. So there is suicide, there is self-violence and violence against others, and social resentment, family resentment, families which are too self-absorbed, I mean the parents, to pay any attention to the kids.
And then do the books offer any paths out or and not solutions, because I mean every person has to find that according to their specific situation, but it sounds a little depressing. Are there bright spots as well in the books?
Well, there is not really like a happy ending or these cheerful chapters or anything like that, but I think in the end there is some optimism in the sense that my characters find strength inside themselves in being loyal to their own idea of principles, in being loyal to those who are close to them, and I think that's optimistic. That gives them some. I think the main issue in general with kids is this crisis of identity, and my books propose this, that in experiencing feeling of community identity, they can find the inner strength they need to survive in this hostile world.
When we were talking earlier, you were talking about one of the problems in their context, and not only in Mexico but in Hungary and Europe where you work as well, is this breakdown of community.
Yes.
So you've got that response of trying to build it. What is it? Do you think that this breakdown of community is more pronounced than it has been in, say, previous generations?
Yes, I think so, because one of the elements that can play an influence on this is that there is more freedom. And freedom also means risks. And the loneliness, because you are on your own and you're responsible for your own choices. So it happens many times. In Europe, I remember I noticed, for instance, in England, that there are this called the key kids. And in Spain, they are called los niños de la llave. These are kids that you find in the streets, in the subway, in public transportation, and they always have a key hanging from their neck, because they are given the keys of their flat because there is no one there. So they are outside on their own. Yes, and they have the key. That means that they have to go back home and eat by themselves, live their own life by themselves until the parents will come home, or one of the parents, because on the other hand, many times these children come from single mothers, single fathers, like in my novels. So they live in a lonely house, and they live like adults with their own keys.
With very little care.
Yes.
The key kids.
Yes.
Well, here we have, there's stories too of the kids who are actually locked in until their parents come,
yes,
because there's no one to take care of them, and that has a profound effect,
yes,
on a child growing up.
But here in Mexico, there is the other case that there are many kids which are lonely, not because the parents are working, but because the parents are dead, or one of the parents is dead, because of the growing violence.
Yeah, there are many, many orphans, and we don't even know how to calculate that as a cost of what's happening now, but I'm sure we'll be seeing the repercussions for many, many years to come.
Yes.
In your teaching as well, as you give these workshops, what do you find to be the response of children to an opportunity to express themselves through literature? Do they respond to that form of expression? I mean, how are they able to articulate what they're feeling?
Yeah, well, I think that the need to express yourself is even stronger than the need to read. I mean, you need to write more than you need to read, and especially those people who are subject to very strong pressure of any kind. And you see even in movies, in cartoons, that prisoners are always writing or scribbling on the walls and drawing. So I think those people who live in these institutions have a very strong need to express themselves. It also gives them the opportunity to re-examine their own life, to reconsider their mistakes, or what it can be considered as their mistakes. So they have a very strong need to express all this inner turmoil, and they write. They like to write. I think they enjoy writing. I remember I had a student, a girl, in the section for girls, who she had been working for one of the cartels, of the drug cartels, and she wanted very much to come out of her period in the institution to write an autobiographical work, because she believed that in this way she could give an example to other girls so that they would not make the same mistakes. Yes.
The process of reflection.
Yes,
for
yes.
sure. Let's talk about your creative process when you sit down to write a new novel or stories for youth in particular. How do you take on that language? Because not only are the stories oriented toward a youthful audience, but the level of the language and the type of language, the level of language has to be adjusted to. How do you get into that mind frame?
I think writers need to have very good hearing and be very attentive. And I try to be. I'm always attentive, trying to pick up the new movements in linguistic usage or language usage. And in Mexico, the Spanish that we speak in Mexico is very flexible and it's very much changing. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who lived in all Spanish-speaking countries, he said that about the Spanish in Mexico, that it's very dynamic in its evolution. So I need to be very attentive, and I think I am, so I try to keep on with the change.
And especially youth are real language innovators.
Yes.
They're inventing new words that describe new experiences. You find that a lot?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you have a novel written for a young audience, when you're thinking about writing it, do you have a specific objective in mind, or do you think mostly about, I want to tell a story? What's the
I try to, I think of myself in the first place. Maybe all writers do that, because I try to write what I would have liked to read when I was a teenager. I try to write about things which are meaningful for me. And I have in mind some kids that are close to me, either because they're relatives or students. So I cannot think of the big audience, because that's very much an abstract concept. I think of those who are close to me and who have reacted in one way or another to my writings.
You grew up in the state of Hidalgo.
Yes.
And still live there when you're not living abroad. Yeah. What are some of the things that had the biggest impact on you when you were that age?
Books. I was many times I was sick. I remember my childhood, a big part of it spent in bed sick. So my source of strength was reading. I was a precocious reader, and the world of my childhood is made of those landscapes that came to my mind through Charles Dickens, for instance. I think that took me to Europe, and that influence is visible in my writings.
And that's what you're seeking to provide to other young people now, that kind of opening new worlds. Yes,
and there is a lot of affinity between contemporary social issues in Mexico and those of Victorian England. If you remember, like Oliver Twist, it is about children who are abused, lonely orphans, subject to different types of violence, exploited, and in these kind of dark, gloomy urban landscapes where life was wild and dangerous. It's very similar to the world of my novels and to the world I see in Mexico.
And there's so many kids, I imagine, we know that confront these issues, and they feel like they're the only one in the world who's confronting these issues, and have no sense that this is something that other kids have gone through. It's one of the great blessings of books, that they can show you, look, other people have faced these kinds of things. And I imagine that it's something that you try to show through your characters. What would be, for example, who's the major character in these books, in El Príncipe de los Tejados?
In these there are three major characters. There is a countryside girl who has to move to the city to start high school, and then she has to face many challenges. She lives with relatives. The uncle is abusive, so that's one of the main characters.
An all too common problem.
Yes, yes, it is. There is, maybe we didn't mention it before, but yes, there are many references to family abuse, or to different types of abuse inside the family environment.
So we've got the girl who comes in from the
Yes,
countryside and has to face an urban environment in a dysfunctional family context.
yes.
And then who else?
Then this girl moves to the house of her uncle and aunt, and then her cousin is a very dysfunctional girl who is sick with chronic depression, and she's manipulative and lonely, resentful to the family. She feels isolated. And then the third main character is the hero of the work, who is a boy who has a kind of double life and double nature, and he's connected to the world of the streets, and from that perspective he's more able to bring strength into this isolated and locked-in world.
Interesting.
Yes.
There's a lot of literature being generated now for adults and some for youth as well that comes out of this culture of crime that we hear in Mexico, and unfortunately in many ways Mexico's getting this reputation as being almost synonymous with organized crime and cartel activity and all the television series that have come out. But you spend a lot of your time as well in Hungary and other countries. Do you see commonalities? Are some of these problems global in scope, or are they very specific to Mexico?
Yeah. Well, I think all these problems which are important in my writing are a global problem, but they take different shapes in different countries, and each country has a political environment that influences the global problems. For instance, the loneliness of young people in general is a global problem, but in Mexico it is related many times to organized crime. Because in Mexico families are very, very united, and we have this tradition of the extended family living together. Mm-hmm. So in a way that helps not to have so many lonely people as in Europe, where people grow old, very lonely, they live alone, they die and nobody notices for days and things like that. In Mexico we don't have that, so apparently we would have all the elements to be always very united as big families, but we are not because of the influence of organized crime. So, for instance, this is an example of a global problem which takes a different shape. And then there are other things which are becoming more and more common, like the problems related to refugees and foreigners and migration movements.
Have you worked at all in the question of migrants and refugees?
And I haven't worked on it as a writer, yeah. But I see it many times in Europe.
Yeah, and of course here as well.
Yes, and here, yes.
Often on the show. So in Mexico, we could say that there's a culture that could facilitate stronger families and children feeling more protected and less alone. But then we have these factors that are really breaking that apart right now. You talked about organized crime. What are some of the other factors that you see that are really jeopardizing the development of young people at this stage?
Growing individualism, the growing of the social gap, economic differences, more stronger material concerns, more consumerism. So people want, there is more hatred between the rich and the poor than before. The rich are afraid of the poor are afraid of the rich, and the poor want to have those things that the other ones have, and they are ready to do anything to get those things. And I think that affects very much the way children experience the connection to the outside.
And the question of values that you were mentioning before, yes. It erodes a lot of those traditional family values that are a part of Mexican culture.
Yes.
I would imagine that's something that you saw with youth in prison when you were working there as well.
Yes. On the other hand, this also has an advantage because in general in the Western world, the official discourse is very much trying to make the idea of family more flexible. Like family is not only father, mother, and children, but it can be two fathers and a child, two mothers and a child, one mother and a child, things like that. And in Mexico, we are used to that very flexible idea of a family. We have children who are brought up by their grandmother or by their aunts, or by one aunt, or live together with their uncles. And then there is also the grandmother many times present in the family. And I think that gives us a lot more flexibility when it comes to understand family as not a monolithic concept.
Well, it's fascinating to have that comparative perspective as well. Agustin, we've come to the end of the show. Thanks so much for being with us. Agustin, the author of these two latest books, El Príncipe de los Tejados y La Casa de los Tres Perros. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.